Everyone, welcome. I'm Noor. I'm CODEPINK's Palestine campaign coordinator, as you may or may not know if you've been joining these calls. Welcome to Missing Piece Mondays. This is our 1 hour monthly gathering. We come together in community. We talk about organizing. We talk about news, updates, things to do, questions you have. Sometimes we bring guests to talk to you all. Today is one of those days. We have a really great guest. So let's get right into it. I'm going to pass it to Grace to go over our norms and we'll get started.
Hi, folks. Thank you so much for joining. I'm Grace, our engagement manager here at CODEPINK. If you want to introduce yourself in the chat, name, location, if you're a returning missing piece member or you're new to our calls. But we really want you, especially for tonight, to remember our norms, to be respectful. This isn't a debate, but
I
a
just want to show
discussion.
you how many people are on
Oh,
this.
if we could stay
Oh,
muted,
wonderful.
that'd be awesome. Thank you so much. We can stay muted. We're not here to mediate arguments. We're here to learn from each other and take action for Palestine. We want to be kind, be curious, and be ready to take action. Today's meeting will be recorded. So please, if you don't want your face, if you don't want your voice recorded, put your questions in the chat, comments in the chat. We'll still get to them and we won't include your name or face. At Missing Piece Mondays, like Nor said, we often invite friends and CODEPINK community members to share their actions, resources, and thoughts on ways we can resist imperialism, the war economy, and the current genocide happening in Palestine. And we encourage you always to do the same. Today, we'll be discussing settler violence in Palestine and strategies, particularly sanctions, to hold settler groups accountable. We have a very special guest joining us, Mohsen Farshneshani, a sanctions attorney with Dawn, who has been leading this work. Right now, peace is missing. Let's bring it back to each other. I'm going to pass it back to Noor to do a brief introduction, and then we'll get started.
Thank you, Grace. I just want to say a little reminder, please, everyone, if you can stay muted, it's a little distracting, just hearing folks in the background. So just to keep everybody on track, let's stay on mute. Okay, and don't take it personally if we mute you ourselves, because sometimes we just have to do that. Okay, so today we're going to be talking all about settlers, settlements, and settler violence in Palestine. So I just want to give like a super brief background on what settlers and settlements are in Palestine. I'm assuming a lot of you probably already know, and Mohsen is going to expand on that a bit. So Mohsen, feel free wherever I like leave gaps to just fill them in during your presentation. But something I just want to kind of like put a disclaimer like real quick is when I talk about settlers and settlements right now, I'm going to be talking about a very like legal definition, and that's very important in conversations like the one we're having, where we talk about sanctioning settler groups, which Mohsen will get into, because sanctioning settler groups is a very legal process. Like it's the US government that we're asking to sanction these settler groups. So, when I talk about settlers and settlements and I talk in the legal definition, I just want to bring that to your attention so that you know we understand the difference between when we're talking about a legal definition and maybe when we're talking about reality and how things actually play out. So I'll talk about that a little bit more later and it'll probably make a little bit more sense. But who are settlers? So settlers are Israeli citizens who live in settlements on private Palestinian land in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, in Palestine. And there are like two different kinds of settlements. There's settlements and outposts. So settlements are authorized under Israeli law, and outposts are actually illegal under Israeli law. They still exist, and the Israeli government kind of like still caters to them. And I believe they're both illegal under international law. But, regardless of whether or not they're illegal under Israeli laws, does that really matter? Because that country kind of commits genocide. So should we really look to them to, be good definers of what is legal and what should be illegal? So like I said, settlers live on settlements on private Palestinian land, and actually about 40% of the West Bank is controlled by Israeli settlements. There's 40% of the land in the West Bank has settlers living on it, right? And I think that when we think about that, it's important to think about the reality of that. If these settlers are living on private Palestinian land, what does that mean? That means that a Palestinian was living there before, right? Because it was privately owned by Palestinians. So that kind of leads you to think, well, how did that Israeli settler come to live there? Because I don't know if you guys are familiar with Palestinians, but we're kind of not really ones to just throw up our hands and let people take our homes, as nobody is, nobody just allows that to happen to them. So this process of settling on Palestinian land it's a very violent one. And there's an Al Jazeera report from November of 2023. So right now we're in February of 2025. So I'm sure the statistic has risen, but there's about 8 instances of settler violence every day in Palestine, and I know that number's probably skyrocketed right now. Like there are probably alarm bells in Mohsen's head, like that's it's way more than that. But that is anything between like violent, property damage, whatever it is, to really like violently injuring Palestinians. So this isn't like, settler violence. It's not something small, right? This is the overtaking of Palestinian land. It's a violent process, and it allows that land to then be annexed and absorbed into the Israeli state. So why are settlements bad? If you couldn't come to your own conclusion from what I just described, but when settlements are legitimized on Palestinian land, it just allows Israel to annex more land and absorb it into, the Israeli state. And not only that, but it fragments Palestinians from each other. So, along with checkpoints that Palestinians have to cross in order to get through Palestine, now there are these settlements where maybe your neighboring village was just a Palestinian village, but now it's overtaken by these settlers. And you probably have an entirely different route to go visit your friend that you could have maybe visited every day before that settlement existed. So, this all also undermines the prospects of a Palestinian state because it just, like I said, allows for more land to be annexed into Israel, and it severely impacts Palestinian morale. Um, so just wanted to be super brief on that. And then the last point I want to finish with, and this kind of connects to what I started with, is that every inch of Israel, every Israeli town had this same violent establishment because every inch of Israel, that genocidal state that exists today, was once Palestine. So, I talk about, like I said, the legal definition of what a settler is, an Israeli citizen that, settles in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. But I really want you guys to think about what that means for every Israeli citizen that lives in what is now Israel proper. All of those people are placeholders so that the Israeli state can continue to expand. And, they kind of hold that ground so that that Israeli state with, a present day occupation with an active call for Palestinians to return is able to exist because Israeli citizens are placeholders on that land, and more people are able to come in and, like somebody said in the chat, squat on Palestinian land and, legitimize it to then be absorbed into Israel proper, that genocidal state that we're all super familiar with. So that's the end of my spiel. I will pass it off to Mohsen, who is a lot more qualified than me in this regard. Mohsen is a U.S. sanctions attorney working with the Sanctions Nomination Initiative team at Dawn. In his legal practice, Mohsen specializes in U.S. economic sanctions administered by OFAC, including compliance, licensing, enforcement, and SDN-List matters. Mohsen first began his work on sanctions in U.S.-Iran trade diplomacy amid the JCPOA talks between the two countries, during which he primarily liaisoned with business leaders, and U.S. officials. Um, he holds a Juris Doctor degree from Howard University School of Law, where he focused on international trade. And Mohsen, he's been working diligently on the sanctions work. We have conversations all the time about this, and he's an expert. And I know you all love to ask questions and learn more. And Mohsen is a great guy for that. He loves to answer questions. He answers mine all the time. So feel free to leave them in the chat as he presents, and we'll collect them all and get to them at the end. Go ahead, Mohsen.
Thank you so much, Noor. I appreciate that. Thank you for introducing me, and thank you for setting the groundwork for this presentation. Everybody on this call, thank you for joining us. Today, we're going to be delving into economic sanctions. You may have heard about sanctions in the past, in the news, or as the third letter in the acronym BDS, right? Boycott, divestment, sanctions. Or you might have heard about it in regards to Russia or Cuba. If you're familiar, Cuban cigars aren't allowed in the United States. That's specifically because it is a Cuban origin good, and by OFAC rules, by OFAC regulations, it is prohibited to bring those in, to import them into the United States. So I just wanted to give you a piece of that, so that you can, I guess, localize it, localize sanctions as it relates to everyday matters and so on. So U.S. sanctions. U.S. sanctions is Washington's preferred tool when it comes to foreign policy, right? What the United States does with bad actors in the world, wherever they wherever they find bad actors or malign actors, what they do is one of the first steps they take is to deny access to the U.S. financial system, right? The U.S. financial system is dominant on the at a global scale. Now, what does that mean? That means about over 80% of the world's trade happens in US dollars. So the United States has a special certain monopoly over effective unilateral sanctions. So what are sanctions? Sanctions are essentially a tool. They're restrictions aimed to influence behavior, that essentially to penalize actions that are misaligned with U.S. interests, right? And how do they do it? They do it by pretty much asking or requiring legally that any U.S. person or any U.S. company or any entity or person within U.S. jurisdiction to not transact with that entity or person or that country, right? So I'm going to share my screen, which I just realized I didn't do. Let's see here. Noor, are we able to share screen on my end, or do I need to be an admin?
You can share your screen, your co-host, unless if you'd rather I share it, that's fine too.
I don't see a button to do that.
Okay,
Assuming
I'll share it.
Okay, great. Thank
Mhm.
you. Excellent. Yeah, so you can go on to the second slide here. So the United States operates, we can say, two types of sanctions programs. And you might have heard about sanctions as it relates to North Korea, Iran, and Cuba, in that, they are comprehensive sanctions. What does that mean? That means that they apply entirely to the entire territory, to the entire country, to the entire government. Examples of that, we see with Cuba, with Iran, or North Korea, right? While those are effective in imposing economic costs, they also have a massive impact on everyday civilians, right? There's another type of sanctions that's a lot more effective, that's a little bit more humanitarian, we say. And those are called smart sanctions, also known as targeted sanctions. Targeted sanctions essentially allow for the United States government to specify the target of the sanctions, to one person or to one entity, to one foreign person or one foreign entity, right? So what does that mean when a foreign person or entity is sanctioned? That means that they are no longer allowed to engage in transactions with US persons and US entities. They're also denied access to the use of US dollars through the global financial system, right? So if there's a wire transfer that comes in from the United States to some sanctioned entity in the world, banks here in the United States dealing in US dollars, really dealing with US dollars anywhere, will deny or rather block a transaction or a wire transfer that's going to a blocked entity. They're legally required to do that. And if the bank doesn't do that, they are held liable criminally or civilly for violating sanctions. To go on to the next slide, we ask ourselves when sanctions work. When do they work exactly, right? They're most effective, and folks agree on this. They're most effective when there's international interconnectivity, right? What does that mean? That means that the target of the sanctions is integrated into the world economy to the point where denial of access to the US-led financial system or the global US-led financial system harms them economically. So what does that mean? Let's say in the case of Iran or North Korea, it's been decades they've been sanctioned. So sanctions won't really have much of an effect on targets in Iran, for instance, as opposed to another jurisdiction where there is a massive amount of international economic interdependence, right? Sanctions also work when there's multilateral enforcement. That means when other countries are involved and are on board with the objectives of the sanctions, right? They're also, they also work when there's clear and achievable goals that are actually, tangible, that can be achieved. An example of a bad goal would be, let's say, a government stepping out of power, completely dismantling itself. Normally, we know governments don't do that. They're self-preserving, and so that's not necessarily an achievable goal, right? That's just one example, of course. Then there's sanctions also work when there's a high level commitment to the sanctions program, right? And we'll get into this a little bit more. A high level commitment from the United States president to impose sanctions against the target to create a change in behavior. That's where we see that sanctions are effective. So a lot of these elements need to be present for sanctions to actually be, functional or effective in achieving goals. In this case, when it comes to the West Bank sanctions program, which we'll get into in a second, President Biden did not show much of a high-level commitment to an escalatory targeting campaign to actually make a substantial change in Israeli behavior when it comes to the West Bank settler violence or the expansion of settlements. So we're going to go on to the next slide, and we're going to ask ourselves, when sanctions don't work, when do they not work? They don't work, as I said, when there's a pariah effect, when the economic isolation that is the effect of like a comprehensive sanctions program creates a hardened leadership resolve, meaning a country like Iran, for instance, is anti-imperialist. Its revolution was based in an anti-imperialist foundationally. And so sanctions aren't something that they will budge on, right? And so we've seen 40-something years of Iranian politics weathering that storm and doing whatever they can, notwithstanding the sanctions. Lack of multilateral support, which means that other countries aren't following the sanctions or abiding by it or don't believe in it. Also, they don't work when they're unrealistic goals, as I said. And then adaptation. sanctions don't work when suddenly a target completely pivots its entire like economic functions out of the, I guess, U.S. framework to be more reliant on others, right? And there's some use cases of it being done very effectively, other cases where it hasn't been very effective, but nonetheless, adaptation is an important piece to this as well. So I mentioned this international interconnectivity versus isolation. Just as a matter, as a rule of thumb, sanctions, targeted sanctions, for instance, wouldn't be that compelling in terms of changing behavior if you're targeting somebody in North Korea, right? Or in Iran, where there's sanctions that are very comprehensive and very little interconnectivity with the international global market. Whereas in a country like Israel, where there's a stock exchange and there's shareholders and there's a very massive risk assessment and everything that's done, and there's a robust economy interconnected with the world, sanctions are very compelling when a target in that jurisdiction is sanctioned. A lot of entities in that country will be very curious, will be very cautious to interact with those targets, right? So I say that to say that in the case of Israel, the ground is ripe for very effective targeted sanctions to have very substantial impact versus another jurisdiction where sanctions are so thorough and imposed that it won't have much of a compelling effect. Thank you. Excellent scrolling, by the way, Noor. Appreciate you. U.S. sanctions. Why do they matter? Why are they any different than sanctions by another country somewhere in the world? As I said before, U.S. sanctions matter, and they're the most impactful, the most powerful because of the leverage that the U.S. dollar has. The use of the U.S. dollar, the dominance of the US dollar in international trade gives the United States government the power it has in imposing sanctions, right? So that's why it's important when we're talking about US sanctions. The program that we got, which we'll get into again, was very important. It was unprecedented, and it could have done a lot. Now, US sanctions matter also because you can strategically target entities that are engaged in sanctionable conduct to essentially toxify an individual or an entity's global network, right? So if you see there's a bad actor somewhere in the world, and because there's no political will, what you can do is, the US government, that is, can target entities surrounding a bad actor and essentially create a enforcement quagmire, right? Where businesses and entities abroad will essentially distance themselves from those entities because of the strategic targeting campaign, right? That's exclusive. I mean, that feature rather isn't exclusive to the United States, but again, the dominance of the U.S. dollar affords that leverage to U.S. sanctions specifically, more so than, let's say, EU sanctions. U.S. sanctions also matter because global compliance. Although sanctions prohibit U.S. persons, there's generally a chilling effect, right, that compels foreign entities to also comply, right? So you don't want to be on America's bad side. You don't want to, let's say there's an entity that's designated as a terror financier, for instance, and you're a local business that has several $1 million of trade business with the United States. You're going to think twice before you continue doing business with that sanctioned terror financier, alleged terror financier. So there's a chilling effect that's substantial here, that U.S. sanctions really has a strong advantage in. And as I said before, sanctions are often Washington's preferred first step in foreign policy. Um, the strategic application, in my view, opens avenues for further accountability and corrective measures. Right. Um, Sanctions in itself is in my view, the tip of the spear. And, before we can't really, in my view, expect a change in US Israel policy or Israel Palestine policy from a US foreign policy perspective until there's a meaningful sanctions program targeting the worst actors that have acted with impunity for decades on end. So moving on, US authorities. What US authorities do we have or did we have to target the malign Israeli actors? Um, and we will start with Executive Order 14115. It was issued in February of 2024. It was first referenced in November of 2023 by President Biden in a op-ed in the Washington Post. It was unprecedented. It allowed for the United States to sanction uh, settler violence and entities that supported it, and those who were involved in the dispossession and displacement of Palestinian civilians in the West Bank. And then, as we know, that executive order was revoked on the very day that President Trump was inaugurated. And so we don't have that anymore. What we're left with now is Executive Order 13818. And what is that? We will scroll down and I will gain. There we go. So Executive Order 13818 are the global Magnitsky sanctions, and no, hold on, we got this. Thank you. And that was issued in December of 2017 by President Trump, right? That allows for the United States government to target individuals and entities that engage in serious human rights abuses, right? There is no precedent where the United States has sanctioned Israelis for human rights abuses against Palestinians under this authority, but it is an authority that we do still have, and we can still set a precedent with that authority. Now, moving to Executive Order 14115, as I mentioned, those were the West Bank sanctions, and they allowed us to do a lot. The sanctionable conduct that was described was, violence or threats against civilians, property dispossession, destruction, or seizure, undermining the West Bank peace, stability, and security, and providing material support to those who engaged in those activities. It was very expansive. If there was a meaningful application campaign, there could have been a lot of sanctions imposed, but unfortunately, we did not see that, right? The initial targets included settlers that were involved in violence. It included leaders that coordinated those attacks and entities that were involved in land seizures and dispossession schemes, and also organizations that were supporting illegal outposts. Illegal outposts are very important, and we'll talk about those in a second. Illegal outposts are essentially they're like settlements before they become official settlements. They're like squatters essentially that just, they pop up. Normally it's done with a few animals and kind of like a trailer home of sorts. And then that's set up as an outpost. They're illegal under Israeli law until, of course, they're not. But moving on, we saw with the executive order, its rise and ruin, right? This is especially disheartening for me. I think about this, and we could have had a lot. We could have had it all, but the Biden administration did not hold its own, and there was not a strong executive willpower when it comes to sanctions. on Israel or on the West Bank settler violence, right? So on February 1st, the sanctions were announced. They were issued through executive order, and the first batch of settlers were sanctioned, right? On February 5th, it was very evident that Israeli banks were blocking the sanctioned settlers' accounts, right? They were very clearly having an effect. There was a panic caused in Israel in its most extremist factions, right? By February 7th, the ministers were panicking and they were out threatening, doing a lot. And so you see that in the middle. U.S. sanctions on extremist settlers put Israel's far-right finance minister in a bind. So Minister Smotrich, he vowed to take action after he saw that Israeli banks, even though they're not U.S. entities, were in fact enforcing those U.S. sanctions, which we see very often in only in jurisdictions where there is a strong economic interdependence and general economic relations between the United States and said country. So it showed that there was a massive effect, that the sanctions were compelling, and they even created a chilling effect for Israeli banks, right? So that was February 7th. Then on March 29th, maybe a month and a half later, if we could scroll slightly lower, actually there's no text, but by March 26th, OFAC issued a letter, right? That letter allowed for Israeli settlers that were sanctioned to maintain financial normalcy. Before I get into the legalese here, I just want to summarize it by saying that like what they issued on March 26th was not precedented. That's not normal. They pretty much carved out a bunch of exceptions that allowed for those sanctioned settlers that were panicking just a month ago when they were first sanctioned to now continue whatever they were doing with financial normalcy. It allowed for the Israeli banks to continue doing transactions with them for what we call basic sustenance. And of course, OFAC says that that's like, that's in line with humanitarian exceptions and what they've done in other programs. But I mean, I'm a lawyer in this field, and you can talk to many other sanctions attorneys. That's not something that they dole out so easily in one letter that renders the entire, set of people that were sanctioned on the program to those exceptions, right? So this was very unprecedented. It was a massive setback. So the White House wavered, and there was an unprecedented blanket carve out in the sanctions program, right? But nonetheless, it was effective. We got a lot of targets down, but there was a general absence of executive willpower here. The Biden administration, we don't know if the executive order started as some sort of red herring, right, to just distract us from the fact that the United States was complicit in genocide in Gaza, or whether it started out as a meaningful attempt to bring some accountability to the West Bank, and then at some point they buckled and they gave up and folded to political pressure from Tel Aviv and the many allies that the extremist Israeli factions have in Washington. But moving on to a lighter note, what we do have today, what do we have today still? We have the global Magnitsky sanctions. We still have this on the books. This is something that President Trump signed in, or rather issued in 2017, right? It allows us to target individuals and entities that are engaged in serious human rights abuses, and of course, corruption that enables harm and instability. Excuse me. The executive order sanctions actors, as I said, who are involved or complicit in serious human rights violations, right? Or they facilitate or benefit from corruption. So as I said before, in terms of the application of these sanctions, of the global Magnitsky sanctions, we haven't seen any Israelis sanctioned for human rights abuses against Palestinians, but we did see sanctions on Israelis in the past. Those names being Dan Gertler and Israel Ziv. Those two gentlemen were involved in some corruption and human rights abuses, I believe, as it relates to the Congo. So that's the precedent we have as it relates to them. But for the most part, GLOMAG has been used to sanction Myanmar generals who were involved in the Rohingya genocide, and Saudi officials who were involved in the Khashoggi assassination, right? So there is some precedent for us to work here, right? We just have to prove and canvass and push and advocate for accountability by way of sanctions for the serious human rights abuses that we have seen in the occupied Palestinian territories. So I just touched on this, but applying GLOMAG to malign Israeli elements, we have to focus on the systematic violence against Palestinian civilians, their forced displacement, and prove that these are human rights abuses, right? And that's what we should do, and that's what we will do with everybody's help. Now, I led this initiative, this sanctions nomination initiative through Dawn, with Dawn, for the past 6, 7 months, 8 months now, and we learned a few things. I learned a few things, and I pushed through it, and we were effective in getting a handful of sanctions on the entities that we asked for sanctions on. But I noticed in my time that there was very little institutional infrastructure for the work we were doing. I don't believe that our communities, our institutions, our pro-peace, our anti-apartheid, our pro-Palestine entities were ready for the authorities that were afforded to the United States government, or rather to the president through this executive order, for a meaningful sanctions campaign. I can tell you very, very honestly that there was very little messaging. There was very little grassroots advocacy on this point. And I learned, and I think that going forward, we should be doing this. We should be setting out institutional infrastructure for our allies to push for meaningful sanctions with unified coordination, right? And that includes public mobilization. The S in BDS needs to be just as prioritized as we've seen boycotts and divestment. We've seen so much organizing there. And, boycotts are essentially sanctions without the legal teeth. Sanctions literally force compliance. They are legally enforced on all U.S. persons. So to me, I mean, I'm a one-trick pony, as I say. This is my forte. I'm a sanctions attorney, but I saw that there was so much potential in this space, and we honestly did not capitalize. So I hope to spend some time to capitalize, or to rather build the institutional support, the grassroots support for meaningful sanctions when we get the opportunity again, right? Also, strategic messaging. There's so many articulate, brilliant minds in this space. So many folks that go on TV that are, that debate folks like Piers Morgan and so many others, that I don't believe are really privy to sanctions, but it's very much so the very tip of the foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy spear. And we did not advocate for its use much. Dawn was kind of alone in that. Myself and Dawn, we have all these allies organizationally, and I thought that we could, be a lot more organized. So I'd love to, build that institutional infrastructure for the next time. we do have that opportunity. And as I said before, we do still have that opportunity. Global Magnitsky sanctions regulations under Executive Order 13818. We are responsible for our fate, and I think that, you know, in the end, sanctions are imposed when there is two types of pressure: intragovernmental pressure from Congress or different, you know, parts of the government, and then when there is public pressure, when there's public pressure asking for those sanctions against these bad actors, right? There's so much going on in Israel Palestine that it's difficult for us to target one entity and one person and one thing and say they need to be denied access from the US financial system to start. Non-started, that's exactly where we need to start. It's very difficult to do that in terms of messaging and prioritizing that. But I think it's extremely necessary if we want to build the foundation to changing the situation in Israel Palestine, whether it's for a two-state solution or whether it's for a one-state solution where there's equal protection for all. That concludes my presentation, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much.